David, tell me about your aviation adventures around Australia.
So I started flying about 20 years ago and got my private pilot's licence. 15 years later, found myself a job in Darwin, flying around Australia for the Bible Society. During those 4 to 5 years, I had a lot of experience flying into remote airstrips and gained some interesting experience along the way.
What would you say it was the most important thing to consider in terms of your pre-trip planning?
The pre-trip planning process on the ground is absolutely essential. So there's things like, well, what is the weather doing? What's it likely to be doing in a few days' time? Is it better to delay the trip? Where can I get fuel? Is it reliable fuel? Is there a fuel truck? Is it a fuel drum? I had an experience where a 15-knot tailwind turned into a 40-knot headwind, so I needed to do a 200 nautical mile diversion to get to a small community that I knew had fuel, and they had 10 drums of avgas and only one of them at the very back was in date. So just things like that that you need to start to think about, and you can eliminate some of those things on the grounds. That was out in the middle of the Tamanai Desert, so maybe plan via Tennant Creek where you know you can have a reliable fuel supply and that type of thing.
Did you get stuck anywhere, ever?
One time I was flying from Mount Isa and I went into Alice Springs, and from there I was going out to a community called Warburton. And there was a little bit of weather due at Warburton, so there wasn't a requirement for a tempo at that period when I was supposed to be landing there, but there became one about half an hour after leaving Alice Springs. So although my fuel reserves were going to be fine to land into Warburton when I took off, it wasn't going to be now that I was airborne. So I called into Ayers Rock to top up some fuel, talked to the briefer and found out that the weather was actually a lot worse than they'd previously forecast. So I grounded myself for 6 hours before I took off to head to Warburton. And although the weather seemed to have settled and I was quite happy to depart, I still had a good amount of daylight. When I took off from Ayers Rock, 10 minutes later, the wind changed and there was now a 30-knot crosswind for Ayers Rock. So I couldn't get back there. I was quite happy to continue to my destination knowing there's a few airstrips along the way. But it's just an example of we can assess all the information before us and make decisions based on that. But when you're actually airborne in a situation, you need to be ahead of some of those options that you need to be able to keep yourself and your passengers safe.
Having done lots of these trips, what would you suggest to people, pilots taking on trips like this? You know, what would you do differently now?
I think the key is really doing your homework. We talked about it at the start of doing thorough flight planning, but it's not just about coming up with this great idea of let's, take the plane up north for some fun. It's really actually knowing what your solid options are along the way. Where can I get fuel? It says in the ERSA I can get fuel. Ring the refueler. Hey, is it likely that I can get fuel? Little tips like that. Sometimes remote places have definite fuel in the ERSA, but if you call them every second Thursday, there's a truck, so there's maybe a 5-hour period that you can't get fuel. So that actually helps you with your planning. It might say that you can get accommodation there, but what's the lead time? Some of these communities have a lot of mining work and they book out 3 to 6 months ahead every single room. So you think, oh yeah, it's all right, I'll just turn up and get a bed. No. So you end up sleeping in the plane.
What do you think is a word that would best describe the mental attitude you should have to take on a trip like this?
Always have options. Whether it be fuel options, options for backup resources, options as far as weather goes. Always have options.